Guys, you will not believe it. I couldn't even believe it the first time I saw it, but the iPad, the original one, is actually turning 10 years old. Technically speaking, it turned 10 years yesterday, and not necessarily its release, but its announcement. And it is so insane that this specific device came out 10 years ago, because there's a lot that, this iPad brought that is obviously still used in a lot of new technology that's still coming out. But just the concept of an iPad, it wasn't anything new. There were definitely still tablets at the time. This thing was released in 2010. It was released in March of 2010, but it was announced in January. And definitely when you look at it, it doesn't look like the latest and greatest. It doesn't look like anything crazy. And of course, like I stated, there were definitely tablets at the time, but the just sheer vast industry that this iPad in and of itself, there are tablets and then there are iPads, and I still think that's completely the case. The tablet industry really is predicated basically for the iPad. Yeah, there's the Samsung Galaxy Tabs and the Google tablets, whatever they've made in the past, but really the iPad stands on its own. And I wouldn't even consider Surface Books and everything like that, but it makes me wonder, if we didn't have the iPads, would we even have Surface Books? Would we even have these crazy, super cool touchscreen laptops, all those things? Yeah, probably would still get them in some form, but the iPad really pushed those industries. It just pushed everything, and I definitely do love the iPads. I love them so much. I've owned every single one of them, and iPads for sure are one of those things that I definitely want to start reviewing more in 2020. So the iPad 1, dude, looking at the front, we have a 9.7 inch display. It's an IPS panel. That resolution is 768 by 1024. What's funny is that this same type of panel, the 9.7 inches, are used on pretty much all those new iPads, the base model iPads that are coming out. I have an iPad Pro 2016 model that uses the 9.7 inch panel. I have owned tons of other iPads that have had that 9.7 inch panel as well. So that's kind of funny when we look at the newer type of, what we have in 2020. That panel size, for some reason, that 9.7 inch size, just spoke out to them, and they've used that on basically every other iPad. The resolution has came up. They're much better now, but at that point, 9.7 inches was a pretty big display at the time when we had a 3.5 inch iPhone. There's quite a bit of bezel around the screen, but it's not that bad. On the bottom, the 30-pin connector, we have a headphone jack, and on the back, you have that Apple logo. And to me, I think this was one of the most premium feeling iPads ever. This thing, even now when I use it, it just feels like a $500 machine still, or even a $1,000 machine. It just gives that impression to me for some reason. It's so weird. In 2020, there's a lot of devices. I think 2010 Apple design-wise killed it. They had the iPhone 4, they had this iPad, and those two things, even in 2020, still feel super premium. And this iPad definitely still feels super premium, even though it might not look like the newest thing or whatever the case is. It still definitely kind of has that impression that it does feel super, super premium, which is one of the best advantages for it. In reality, there's really not too much outside of that is pretty much still usable in this day and age, but that case in and of itself is super premium, and it just screams to me like quality. And even if you get an iPad now, for a while that thing is still going to be lasting. Even the iPad 2, I have the iPad 2, I have the iPad 3, and those devices feel super premium still too. But for some reason, the first iPad feels way more premium than the other one. Now, talking about the software updates, this thing really only got a couple, maybe one version of software as far as I know. It started off with iOS 4. You were able to upgrade it to iOS 5.1.1, and it didn't really go further than that. Now, the sad thing is that because of that, there really isn't too much to go forward or backwards. There's really not too much to talk about. Obviously, this thing is not getting any more software updates. It didn't get iOS 13 or anything like that. But what I can tell you is that in terms of the software itself, it's really one of the more interesting aspects of this, because, performance-wise, obviously it's not the best performing device. It can't really download a lot of apps, or any apps for that matter, that are still compatible for this software. But the weird thing is that because this is such an old software, it really doesn't glitch up as much. When I was using it, I was expecting it to be super slow, like my iPhone 4, for example, that is super glitchy and everything. On iOS 7, it really isn't that smooth of an experience, but for my iPad the first one that came out, I was expecting it to be slower than what it was. But the whole entire UI is pretty decent. If you look through the settings and everything, it's kind of funny because you can kind of see all these newer or all the older versions of the new apps that we use now. Like if you go into notes or if you go into settings, you can still see that kind of makes sense. It looks kind of the same. So I wonder if Apple is ever going to change this layout. Yeah, they did it with iOS 7, but the fact that we can still see a lot of the similarities is kind of crazy. I think Apple should go with iOS 14 and change up everything, but they're probably not. But with this iPad, it's so funny to see how the software-wise, we can still see a lot of what the newer versions have in this older version of software, which is pretty crazy, which might make sense to a lot of people, but for me, I honestly wasn't expecting that. So software-wise, like I said, you're outdated. There might be a jailbreak for it. I'm honestly not too sure. But considering iOS 5.1.1 was released so long ago, I want to say there might be a jailbreak for it. So if you have that capability, go for it. And I think there was something a long time ago called jailbreak door, undoor, unclear door, something. I don't remember the name of it, but basically it allows you to get, a UI of the newer software on older versions. And if somebody knows the name of it, or you even have a link of how to install it or whatever, leave it down in the comment section. Maybe someone can look at it. But yeah, that's pretty crazy, man. Software wise, you're completely outdated. But now kind of rolling that over to the performance. Okay, so I want to say back in 2010, this thing was kind of killer in terms of the spec department. Now, okay, you're kind of laugh at it. But this thing came out with the Apple A4 chip, a single core 1.0 gigahertz Cortex A8 CPU, and there were actually 3 different models of the iPad 1. So they actually had a 16 gigabyte, a 32 gigabyte, and 64 gigabyte model. I'm actually surprised that they had a 64 gigabyte model back in 2010. That's actually pretty impressive. Now, all of those models had 256 megabytes of RAM, so a quarter of a gigabyte of RAM on all the models. So, take it as you will, but this thing was it's definitely not obviously a performance. I mean, our cameras, our water bottles, our literally anything, our rakes have more RAM than, this iPad. I gotta stop saying that. That's not even a funny joke anymore. It's kind of corny, to be honest. But this iPad at this moment in time is probably not obviously the best performing device. It really can't do much for it. But what I will tell you is back in 2010, it was actually not that bad of a device. I think that's the best way I can put it. Now what's weird is that I think the iPhone 4 had twice the amount of RAM as this iPad, but it makes sense because the iPad came out way before the iPhone 4 came out. So it came out in early of the year. The iPhone 4 came out later on in the year. So this thing technically had the same amount of RAM as the iPhone 3GS. So I guess it's okay. It's not that big of a deal. But it is kind of crazy to think that back in 2010, this thing was the most capable iPad at the time. This thing was something you were able to go and bring with you, and in a way be a computer replacement or a MacBook replacement, kind of like how now we don't really consider iPads MacBook replacements. I'm sure the mindset was the same at that point. People were just considering this iPad to be like a bigger version of the iPhone, which as we know now in this day and age, it really isn't the case. It's kind of like its standalone device. Like if you go somewhere, most of the time you're bringing your iPhone and your iPad and your MacBook. It's usually not one or the other. You're still bringing your iPhone, but some people are slowly kind of going into the iPad realm. In 2010, I'm sure some people out there were replacing their MacBooks for their iPads, and the fact that they were using this thing with a quarter gigabyte of RAM, with a single core 1.0 gigahertz, with the Apple A4 chip, like it's crazy to think. But at that time, apps were not demanding. They weren't demanding like how they are now. We didn't have devices with 12 gigabytes of RAM and crazy amount of specs inside of them back in 2010. So I don't want to say this thing is the worst performing device, because obviously it's going to be. It's a super old device. It's a decade old, but it is pretty insane to see that the evolution that we've seen since then. And the RAM is something that really got me. I was not expecting the RAM to be like that, but it's still smooth though, which is really funny. It's still a smooth performing device. It's just not a fast performing device, and I can't even get any apps installed on it. So that pretty much covers it up in terms of the performance. Now hitting on the battery, there's no camera on this thing, so there's no reason to even talk about it, but this thing has a 6600 milliamp hour battery, which I'm going to say it right now, it's not at that full 6600 anymore. It's probably at like 4000 or something because of the battery degradation over time. But what I will tell you is that the iPad's battery life has always been one of its strong suits, and this first iPad is no exception. This thing is completely underpowered. The screen isn't even the high resolution. It's not. I don't even think it's a Retina display, because they didn't even make the Retina technology until the iPhone 4. But this thing with that big size battery was able to last you so long. And there was a time, I think last year, where I literally charged it one time and I made a video about it, and then literally like 4 months later I went to go pick it up and it still had battery in it, which is so insane. Maybe it was like 2 months or 3 months, but it definitely wasn't like more than like 5 months, but it was a long period of time. And this standby time on this device is crazy. And to think that since then Apple has really shown like the same format that this iPad brought has been ported over to every single iPad since the last 10 years. I mean, iPads are still known for being, I guess, decent performing devices, how this thing was at the time. Big screen, that 9.7 inch panels, but now we have those 11.9 inch and 12 point whatever those ones are. A smooth experience overall, the bigger display, which I really, really like, kind of pushing the boundaries at the time. Extremely great build quality, and those big battery sizes. Those same formats and those same, I guess, check marks have been ported over to every single iPad since then. And of course, with the newer iPads, they're more premium and they're better and everything. This first iPad is the one that stemmed it, and a full 10 years later, what I can tell you is that surprisingly, it's still not that bad. Like, yeah, it's not the fastest thing. It's not barely even, I don't even think it's usable for that matter. I mean, you can't log into a lot of things. You can't download a lot of apps. Like, you can't get Snapchat. There's no cameras on this thing. But I think for the time being, but I think for what it was at the time and what it brought to the table and how it's still kind of looked at now, it's still super, super impressive. And I have nothing but love for this iPad. I mean, it's super impressive what Apple is able to do. They literally made their own industry. And of course, people are going to say it's just a tablet or whatever. And they're kind of right, but it's more than just a tablet, bro. It's an iPad. And Apple needs to hire me as a spokesperson, because what I just said, like, I guarantee you I just made like 10 people buy an iPad 1 right now. So I think that pretty much covers it. If you guys have any other questions or anything, leave it down in the comment section below. Hit that like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also, check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel, all those things are linked down below. I'd really appreciate if you guys could check it out. But more importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.